The village of Thornfield had celebrated Christmas with the sort of meticulous dedication that only the English could muster. Decorations appeared in windows by the 1st of December, carol singers rehearsed their selections with military precision, and the bakery began its annual production of mince pies 3 weeks before the holiday itself. Miss Jane Marple, now in her 83rd year, had lived through 70 of those Christmases in St. Mary Mead, and she could confidently say that this year would be remembered not for its festive cheer, but for the extraordinary manner in which death had chosen to announce itself. It was Boxing Day, that peculiar British institution where the excitement of Christmas past and the promise of New Year future hung suspended in the grey English air. The Thornfield estate, a considerable property some 3 miles outside the village proper, had invited the entire neighbourhood to its annual Boxing Day luncheon. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian mansion, all red brick and mullioned windows, the sort of place that seemed to collect secrets in its corners as naturally as it collected dust. Lord and Lady Thornfield were elderly but energetic hosts, having spent the morning decorating the dining room with holly and ivy, the scent of which mingled pleasantly with the aroma of roasting turkey from the kitchens below. Miss Marple had arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, as she always did when invited to formal gatherings. She had learned long ago that punctuality prevented the awkwardness of late arrivals, when people had already settled into their conversations and positions, leaving latecomers forced to squeeze themselves into uncomfortable corners. She wore her navy dress with the white collar, a string of pearls that her sister-in-law had given her 30 years prior, and a brooch depicting a small bird that her nephew had purchased from an antiquary. She carried with her a modest box of Christmas crackers, homemade by herself the previous week, containing small gifts that she had assembled with the sort of careful consideration that only unmarried elderly women could achieve. The drawing-room, where guests were gathered before the luncheon, presented the usual tableau of small-town social hierarchy. Lord Thornfield stood by the window, his weathered face marked by the sort of pleasant expression that comes from generations of inherited wealth and responsibility. Lady Thornfield moved among the guests with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 50 years managing precisely such occasions. Their son, Charles Thornfield, a man of perhaps 55 with thinning hair and a somewhat harried expression, stood near the fireplace in conversation with the vicar. Charles had recently returned from London, where he maintained a flat and a career in something vaguely financial that nobody quite understood but everyone accepted as legitimate. Among the assembled guests were the usual cast of village characters. There was Mrs. Patricia Ashford, a widow of some 10 years, whose late husband had been a surgeon. She was a handsome woman still, with expertly arranged silver hair and the sort of jewelry that spoke of former prosperity and present careful stewardship of resources. She was accompanied by her daughter, Miss Eleanor Ashford, a woman of 32, who had never married and who taught French at the girls' academy in the nearest town. Eleanor had inherited her mother's looks, but seemed to have acquired, in their place, a nervous disposition that manifested itself in quick, jerky movements and a tendency to laugh rather too loudly at the vicar's modest jokes. Then there was Mr. Stephen Blackwell, the solicitor who managed the legal affairs of most of the village's prominent families. He was a thin, precise man of perhaps 60, with steel-rimmed spectacles and a manner of speaking that suggested he had learned English from a legal textbook rather than from ordinary social interaction. His wife, Marjorie, was a sharp-featured woman whose primary occupation seemed to be the maintenance of gossip networks throughout the village. She sat perched on the edge of a wing-back chair like a bird, ready to take flight at any moment, her eyes darting from conversation to conversation, absorbing and cataloguing every word. The final notable guest was Mr. James Hawthorne, the estate manager at Thornfield, who had served in that capacity for some 23 years. He was a man of perhaps 58, with the sort of weather-beaten complexion that comes from a life spent outdoors in all seasons. Unlike the other guests, he seemed somewhat uncomfortable in the formal drawing-room, his large hands occupying themselves with the stem of a sherry glass, as if it might escape if he did not maintain constant vigilance over it. He had arrived at Thornfield as a young man, unmarried and with few prospects, and had worked his way up from groundskeeper to the position of considerable authority and trust that he now held. Miss Marple settled herself into a comfortable chair and accepted a glass of sherry from a passing servant. She had long ago perfected the art of being simultaneously present and unobserved at such gatherings. She could sit quietly, offering a comment here and there, nodding thoughtfully at the village gossip, while actually processing the intricate social dynamics of the room with the precision of a master chess player observing a complex game. She noted the way that Eleanor Ashford Dee's eyes followed Charles Thornfield as he moved about the room. She observed the faint tension in Mr. Blackwell's jaw when someone mentioned property tax increases. She saw the moment when James Hawthorne's expression shifted when Lord Thornfield patted him on the shoulder in a manner that was perhaps slightly too familiar. The butler announced luncheon at 1:30, and the company moved toward the dining room. A long table had been prepared, laden with the traditional Boxing Day fare, cold turkey, sliced ham, an impressive selection of pickles and chutneys, fresh bread, and a number of elaborate salads that Lady Thornfield had orchestrated from her kitchen. At each place setting there lay a small Christmas stocking, the kind that one fills with tiny gifts and confections. Lord Thornfield had, for as long as anyone could remember, insisted upon this charming tradition. It was a quirk of his character that had become so expected that no Christmas gathering at Thornfield seemed complete without these small fabric containers hanging from the back of each chair like promises of small delight. The guests took their places according to a seating arrangement that Lady Thornfield had clearly calculated with considerable thought. Miss Marple found herself seated between the vicar and Mr. Blackwell, a position that was, she reflected, neither central enough to impose upon the main social currents nor peripheral enough to suggest any social disadvantage. She had long ago accepted that such careful positioning was less about comfort and more about the management of social impression, and she bore it with her characteristic good humor. The luncheon proceeded in the manner of such events, with conversation flowing like a well-practiced stream. People discussed the weather, the difficulties of finding good domestic help, the absurdity of television programming, and the shock-ing behavior of young people in general. Charles Thornfield told an amusing story about his flat in London being plagued by pigeons. Eleanor Ashford asked questions about French agricultural practices that seemed to interest no one. Mrs. Ashford smiled frequently but said little. It was the sort of gathering that would, in its normal progression, end in mid-afternoon when guests began to take their leave, citing various domestic obligations and the necessity of settling in before darkness fell. But it was shortly after 2:00, as servants were clearing the main course and preparing to bring in the pudding and cheese, that Lord Thornfield reached for his Christmas stocking with the evident pleasure of a man retrieving a childhood treasure. He opened it with the enthusiasm of someone unaware of his own ridiculous delight in such small things, and reached inside to extract a small box wrapped in tissue paper. He tore away the wrapping, and the room continued its pleasant hum of satisfied conversation. Then, quite suddenly, Lord Thornfield made a sound, not a scream precisely, but rather a sort of strangled gasp followed by a violent coughing fit. His face, which had been pleasantly flushed with wine and good company, transformed almost instantly into a shade of deepest crimson. His hand flew to his throat, the small box falling to the floor. The room, which had been operating under the gentle pressure of post-lunch contentment, erupted into chaos as various guests attempted simultaneously to understand what was occurring, to assist, and to retreat from the apparent emergency. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly still for precisely 3 seconds. She set down her water-glass with deliberate care, noted the precise expression on each person's face as they reacted to Lord Thornfield's distress, and then, and only then, rose to her feet with a determined composo. Of a woman who had lived long enough to know that panic never solved anything, and that careful observation in moments of crisis often proved far more valuable than frantic action. The doctor, fortunately, was among the guests. Dr. Edmund Price had come to the luncheon somewhat reluctantly, having preferred to spend Boxing Day in the company of his wife and their 3 grandchildren, but Lady Thornfield's invitations were the sort that one did not refuse without substantial cause. He moved toward Lord Thornfield with the urgent efficiency of a man whose professional instincts had been immediately activated by the signs of medical distress. He placed a hand upon the elderly man's shoulder and leaned in to examine his face, his eyes already calculating, already processing the visual evidence of whatever catastrophe had befallen his host. "Water," Dr. Price commanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. "Someone fetch water immediately, and loosen his collar." Charles Thornfield, demonstrating that reflexive obedience that sons often show toward authority figures, rushed to his father's side and began fumbling with the buttons of Lord Thornfield's shirt. Lady Thornfield, by contrast, stood at the opposite end of the table with her hands pressed to her mouth, her composure shattered in a manner that seemed to surprise even herself. The servants, who had been trained to manage crises with British reserve, began hurrying about with water glasses and cushions, their movements precise, but their expressions confused. Miss Marple observed all of this with the still attention of someone watching a complex theatrical performance. She noted the precise moment when Eleanor Ashford rose from her chair, her face gone pale. She observed that Mrs. Ashford had reached across the table to grasp her daughter's arm, her jewelry catching the light as she did so. She saw that Mr. Blackwell had removed his spectacles and was cleaning them with a handkerchief, an action she recognized as a nervous habit rather than any genuine necessity. James Hawthorne had pushed his chair back so forcefully that it had toppled backward, and he stood now with his hands clenched at his sides, his weathered face displaying an emotion that might have been shock or might have been something far more complicated. Dr. Price, having examined Lord Thornfield's throat and listened to his breathing with considerable concern, turned to face the assembled company. "Has anyone called for an ambulance?" he asked. When no immediate response came, he continued, "Someone must do so at once. Lord Thornfield appears to be experiencing a severe allergic reaction. His throat is swelling, and his breathing is becoming increasingly labored. We need the ambulance, and we need it immediately." The telephone call was made by Charles, who rushed from the dining room with the sort of desperate purpose that fear and filial duty could inspire. The remaining guests stood or sat in varying states of distress, the cheerful Boxing Day luncheon transformed in the space of mere minutes into something resembling a disaster scene. Dr. Price had managed to ease Lord Thornfield into a chair, and he was now attempting to monitor the patient's vital signs while simultaneously trying to determine what had caused the reaction. His eyes kept returning to the small box that had fallen to the floor, which lay now among the scattered debris of the luncheon table. It was Miss Marple who, moving with the deliberate care of a woman her age, bent to retrieve the box. She did not touch it directly, but rather used a napkin to pick it up, an action that the doctor noticed with what appeared to be grateful recognition. She examined it carefully without opening it, her eyes taking in every detail of its company. Instruction. The box itself was small, no more than 2 inches in length, and it had been wrapped in tissue paper that was now partially torn. The contents, whatever they had been, remained inside, though something had clearly escaped into Lord Thornfield's mouth when he had opened it. "May I?" Miss Marple asked Dr. Price, holding up the box. He nodded, and she proceeded to open it with the same careful attention she might have given to examining a rare fossil. Inside the box, nestled in cotton wool, were what appeared to be several small bonbons, the sort of luxury confection that one might purchase at an expensive sweet shop in London, or perhaps from the continental shelves of Harrods. But it was the nature of the packaging and the deliberate manner of their arrangement that caught Miss Marple's attention. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to place these sweets in this particular location, on this particular day, in this particular manner. "These appear to be the culprit," Miss Marple said quietly to Dr. Price, who was now administering some sort of injection to Lord Thornfield from a small bag that he had retrieved from his motor car, which had been brought round by one of the servants who had rushed outside at his request. "Though I must say, I cannot identify any obvious poison or contaminant. They appear to be ordinary bonbons." Dr. Price, who had been focused entirely upon his patient's medical treatment, turned to look at what Miss Marple held. "Bonbons?" he said, and then his expression changed. "Nuts," he said suddenly. Lord Thornfield has a severe nut allergy. He has for years. It nearly killed him once before, 10 years ago, when someone inadvertently served him a dish containing crushed pistachios. He turned to Charles, who had returned from making the telephone call. "Charles, your father cannot consume nuts of any kind. These bonbons, they almost certainly contain nuts. Ground almonds, perhaps, or pistachios, or walnuts." The ambulance arrived some 20 minutes later, by which time Lord Thornfield's condition had stabilized somewhat, though his breathing remained labored and his color remained that alarming shade of red. He was carefully transferred to a stretcher and carried from the house, Dr. Price accompanying him to the hospital with a grim expression that suggested he was not entirely confident of the outcome. Charles, displaying the appropriate combination of filial duty and shock, departed in his own motor car to follow the ambulance. The remaining guests lingered in the dining room, no one quite knowing whether to leave or to remain, whether to speak or to observe a sort of shocked silence. Lady Thornfield had been led away by a sympathetic servant, and the atmosphere of the room had transformed into something altogether different from the pleasant gathering it had been mere minutes earlier. The Christmas stockings, which had seemed so charming and festive when first observed, now appeared somewhat sinister in their small cloth forms, hanging from the backs of chairs like small harbingers of doom. It was the vicar, after a suitable interval, who suggested that perhaps the guests ought to remain where they were until certain questions had been asked. He did not, he explained, wish to cast aspersions or to suggest anything untoward. But it did seem rather important to establish how, precisely, a box containing nuts had come to be placed in a Christmas stocking belonging to a man with a well-known and serious nut allergy. The vicar's words hung in the air like an accusation, though he had taken considerable care to frame them as mere practical observation. Miss Marple, who had settled herself back into her chair with the composure of a woman entirely accustomed to such disruptions, found her eyes drawn to the Christmas stocking that still hung behind Lord Thornfield's empty chair. Someone in this room, she reflected, had known precisely what they were doing. Someone had known about the allergy, had obtained or prepared these specialized bonbons, had deliberately placed them in this particular stocking with the clear intention of causing harm. The question, of course, was who, and more importantly, why someone would wish to do such a thing to a man who, by all accounts, was generally well liked and respected in the community. She began, almost without conscious effort, to reconstruct the timeline of the morning. Someone had filled these stockings. Someone had placed them upon the chairs before the guests arrived. Someone had made deliberate choices about what to include in each one. Had Lord Thornfield's stocking been filled by Lady Thornfield herself, as tradition might suggest, or had someone else undertaken this task? It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of small detail that most people would overlook entirely, and yet it was precisely the sort of detail that often opened doors to considerably larger truths. The police arrived within the hour, summoned by the vicar's cautious telephone call to the constabulary. Inspector Derek Morrison was a man of approximately 50 years, with the sort of methodical demeanor that suggested he had spent his entire career in provincial police work, attending to matters both serious and mundane with equal attention. He was accompanied by Sergeant Timothy Blake, a younger man whose eagerness to demonstrate competence was evident in every gesture, and whose notepad was already filled with preliminary observations before he had even entered the dining room. Inspector Morrison surveyed the scene with the careful attention of someone cataloguing evidence. He noted the Christmas stockings, the table arrangements, the general posizione of the guests. He requested that no one leave the room until preliminary statements had been taken, a request that was received with varying degrees of resignation and anxiety by the assembled company. He then turned to Miss Marple with an expression of mild recognition. "Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head slightly, "I believe we have encountered each other on previous occasions in matters of a criminal nature." It was, Miss Marple reflected, a generous description of their prior meetings, which had involved her providing observations to the police with a consistency that suggested either remarkable coincidence or a particular talent for being present at moments when violence intruded upon the quiet rhythms of village life. She smiled gently and acknowledged that indeed They had crossed paths before, though she hoped the inspector would forgive her for wishing that such meetings might be less frequent. Inspector Morrison established a temporary office in Lord Thornfield's study and began the process of interviewing each guest individually. Miss Marple observed the various guests as they departed and returned, noting the subtle shifts in their demeanor as they processed what had occurred. Eleanor Ashford emerged from her interview with red-rimmed eyes and the expression of someone who had just experienced a profound shock. Mrs. Ashford maintained her composure, though her fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag throughout the afternoon. Mr. Blackwell returned to the dining room with his characteristic precision restored, though his jaw remained tightly clenched. The vicar seemed relieved to have been interviewed, as if the formal process had absolved him of some personal responsibility for the tragedy. It was James Hawthorne's interview that seemed to take the longest. He was closeted in the study for nearly 45 minutes, a duration that caused VAR. EUU used guests to exchange meaningful glances and lower their voices in hushed speculation. When he finally emerged, he looked considerably diminished, his weather-beaten face appearing almost grey in the afternoon light. He did not return to the dining room, but instead made his way toward the kitchens, where he disappeared from general observation. Between interviews, Inspector Morrison requested that each Christmas stocking be carefully examined and its contents catalogued. This revealed that Lord Thornfield's stocking had contained, in addition to the dangerous bonbons, a silk handkerchief, a small bottle of expensive cologne, and several items of luxury confectionery that appeared to be entirely harmless. The other stockings contained various combinations of similar items: silver-plated button hooks, monogrammed stationery, small volumes of poetry, bottles of sherry, and boxes of tea. They were, without exception, the sort of gift items that one might procure from the more expensive shops in Bath or London, items that suggested considerable expense and careful selection. It was Miss Marple who, with her characteristic delicacy, raised the question that the inspector had not yet voiced. "Might I inquire, Inspector," she asked, during one of the intervals, when various officers were occupied with their cataloguing, whether Lady Thornfield prepared these stockings herself, or whether the task might have been delegated to someone else. It was a question asked with such apparent innocence that it took a moment for its significance to register. Inspector Morrison paused, in the act of making notes in his own small book. "An excellent question, Miss Marple," he said, "and one to which I confess I do not yet have a definitive answer. Lady Thornfield was, as you might imagine, quite distressed by the events. However, she did indicate that she had prepared the stockings persona. Lee, beginning some 3 days prior to today. She filled them in her sitting room, which is situated on the second floor of the house. According to her account, she completed the task yesterday evening and placed the stockings in her bedroom overnight before bringing them downstairs this morning, approximately 1 hour before the guests were expected to arrive. And yet," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "it would be possible for someone to have entered her sitting room during those 3 days and to have substituted the contents of Lord Thornfield's stocking, or indeed to have added an item to it without Lady Thornfield's knowledge. The house, I presume, contains numerous servants and family members, all of whom would have access to the upper floors as part of their normal daily routine." The inspector's expression suggested that this possibility had not previously occurred to him, or at least not with the clarity that Miss Marple's observation now provided. He rose from his chair and departed to conduct a further interview with Lady Thornfield, seeking to establish precisely what had been in Lord Thornfield's stocking when she had last observed it, and whether she had noticed anything unusual or out of place in her sitting room during the relevant period. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the assembled guests had begun to engage in that peculiar activity that English people undertake when faced with dramatic events. They began to speculate carefully about the motives and circumstances involved. Conversation, which had been entirely absent in the immediate aftermath of the poisoning attempt, gradually resumed, though it was conducted in hushed tones and frequently interrupted by nervous glances toward the doorway. "One must consider," Mr. Blackwell said, in the tone of a man accustomed to legal reasoning and careful analysis, "whether this was indeed an assassinatio. An attempt, or perhaps a terrible accident. Someone might have inadvertently placed these bonbons in Lord Thornfield's stocking, not realizing the nature of his allergic condition. But surely, Mrs. Ashford countered. Anyone in this village who has lived here for more than 5 minutes knows about Lord Thornfield's allergy. It is hardly a secret. When he collapsed at the Harvest Festival 10 years ago, it was remarked upon by absolutely everyone. The entire incident was discussed extensively in the parish newsletter. Eleanor Ashford, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke with surprising vehemence. "The question is not whether people knew about the allergy, Mother. The question is who among us would have the motive to wish Lord Thornfield harm." She paused, and then added more quietly, "And who would have the opportunity to access Lady Thornfield's sitting room without being observed?" Miss Marple, listening to this exchange with the sort of gentle attention she had cultivated over decades of village life, noted the precise moment at which Eleanor spoke. She observed the way that her hands trembled slightly as she raised her teacup to her lips. She saw the flash of something, anxiety perhaps or fear, cross the young woman's face. But she said nothing, merely sipped her own tea and continued her careful observation of the room and its inhabitants. By late afternoon, as the winter light began to fade into the premature darkness of December, Inspector Morrison had completed his initial interviews. He emerged from the study with Sergeant Blake and announced that while the investigation would necessarily continue, there appeared to be no immediate danger to the remaining guests. He suggested, however, that no one should depart Thornfield without providing the police with a forwarding address and assurances of their availability for further questioning. Lord Thornfield, he had learned by telephone from the hospital, had stabilized. He had been given emergency treatment to counteract the allergic reaction, and while he remained in considerable discomfort, the doctors were now confident that he would recover. As the guests began to prepare for their departure, Miss Marple found herself standing once more in the drawing-room, where the decorations seemed now to mock rather than celebrate the season. She gazed out the window at the darkening gardens, her mind working through the puzzle with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to finding patterns in human behavior. Someone in this house, or someone connected to this house, had attempted to poison Lord Thornfield. The why remained unclear, but the how was gradually becoming apparent. And it was the how, Miss Marple had learned long ago, that often revealed the who, which in turn illuminated the why. The Christmas stocking that had been intended to bring joy had instead become the instrument of attempted murder, and somewhere beneath the surface of this pleasant village gathering lay secrets and resentments that were only beginning to emerge into the light. The evening following the poisoning attempt descended upon Thornfield with the peculiar heaviness that accompanies disrupted normalcy. Lady Thornfield, having been released from police questioning, and having received the welcome news that her husband would likely recover, had retreated to her bedroom with a sedative administered by Dr. Price. Charles remained at the hospital, maintaining a vigil beside his father's bed in the private room that had been secured for him. The servants moved about the house with subdued efficiency, their usual cheerful Boxing Day preparations abandoned in favor of a quiet efficiency that suggested shock had penetrated even the professional composure of the domestic staff. Miss Marple had accepted Lady Thornfield's hesitant invitation to remain at the house for the evening, an invitation extended partly out of courtesy, and partly, Miss Marple suspected, out of a desire not to be entirely alone in a house where violence had intruded so suddenly upon the sanctity of family tradition. She had been installed in one of the guest rooms, a pleasant chamber decorated in shades of cream and pale blue, and she now sat by the window in the gathering darkness, her knitting needles clicking with meditative rhythm as she worked upon a sweater that had occupied her attention for the better part of 3 months. The house around her was not silent precisely, but rather filled with the sort of muted sounds that large old buildings produce when their inhabitants are distressed or preoccupied. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors. A door closed somewhere above. Water ran through pipes hidden behind walls. These sounds, which in normal circumstances would barely register upon her consciousness, now seemed laden with significance. Miss Marple found herself wondering which of these sounds might have occurred 3 nights ago, when someone had entered Lady Thornfield's sitting room with the deliberate intention of placing poisoned bonbons in a Christmas stocking. There came a knock upon her door at approximately 7:30, just as Miss Marple was considering whether she should descend to dinner or request a tray in her room. She opened it to find James Hawthorne standing in the corridor, his hat in his hands and an expression of barely contained anxiety upon his weathered face. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man unaccustomed to addressing persons of her social standing in matters of a personal nature. "I wondered if I might speak with you for a moment, if you have the time. It concerns a matter I believe may be relevant to the inspector's investigation." Miss Marple set down her knitting and gestured for him to enter. She settled herself in the chair by the window and indicated that he should take a seat, though he remained standing, his discomfort evident in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I have been thinking," he began, "about who might have wished to harm Lord Thornfield, and I confess that I have come to possess information that I believe the inspector should know, though I have been reluctant to volunteer it because of the implications it carries." "For whom?" Miss Marple asked gently. "For whom do these implications carry weight?" Hawthorne was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the window where Miss Marple's reflection was visible against the darkness outside. "For myself," he said finally, "and for others who have no involvement in this matter but who might be damaged by the full disclosure of certain facts that the investigation would necessarily uncover." "I see," Miss Marple said, and her tone suggested that she did indeed see, or at least suspected she did. "Then perhaps you might begin by telling me precisely what information you possess, and we shall consider together whether its disclosure is truly necessary for the investigation." What followed was a confession, though not of the sort that Inspector Morrison was seeking. Hawthorne revealed that approximately 6 months prior he had become involved in a financial arrangement with Lord Thornfield of a somewhat irregular nature. Lord Thornfield had, it appeared, been engaged in some questionable business practices regarding the management of estate funds, and he had enlisted Hawthorne's assistance in concealing the extent of these irregularities from the accountants and solicitors who audited the estate's finances. It was not theft, precisely. Hawthorne explained, his voice carrying the defensive tone of a man attempting to justify actions he knew to be ethically dubious. Lord Thornfield merely wished to make certain investments without the knowledge or approval of Mr. Blackwell, who is quite rigid in his views regarding the proper management of capital. But the arrangement required my assistance, and I confess that I accepted payment for my involvement. It was not a large sum, but it was sufficient to secure my family's position for several years to come. And has anyone else knowledge of this arrangement?" Miss Marple inquired. "I fear that Charles may suspect," Hawthorne admitted. "He returned from London some 3 weeks ago, and almost immediately he began asking questions about the estate accounts, matters that are not typically his concern. I believe he may have discovered some inconsistency that aroused his suspicion. Furthermore, I have reason to believe that Eleanor Ashford may have become aware of the situation through her acquaintance with Charles." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. "Might I inquire how Miss Ashford came to possess this knowledge?" Hawthorne's expression became even more uncomfortable. "Eleanor has been, that is to say, she and Charles have become rather close during his recent stay in the village. They have spent considerable time together. It is possible that in moments of privacy, Charles revealed to her certain concerns he harbors regarding his father's business practices. I do not know this for certain, but it is a reasonable supposition given the circumstances. And your concern," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "is that if the investigation into this poisoning attempt uncovers the financial irregularities, your own involvement will necessarily be revealed, along with the implications that such a revelation would carry for your employment and your reputation." "Precisely so," Hawthorne confirmed. "Though I must emphasize, Miss Marple, that I had no involvement in this poisoning matter. My only desire in coming to you is to determine whether the information must necessarily be disclosed to the police, or whether it is possible to contain the investigation to matters more directly relevant to the attempt upon Lord Thornfield's life." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the window, gazing out into the darkness. She was aware of Hawthorne's anxiety, his desperate hope that she might offer him some path through this dilemma that avoided the full exposure of his actions. She was also aware, with the sort of certainty that came from decades of observing human nature, that he was telling her only a portion of the truth. There was more to his involvement in Lord Thornfield's financial arrangements than he had disclosed, though whether that further involvement was criminal or merely ethically questionable remained to be determined. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said finally, turning back to face him, "I must tell you that I cannot advise you to conceal information from the police, particularly when that information might be relevant to their investigation. However, I would suggest that you speak directly with Inspector Morrison and provide him with a complete account of your financial involvement with Lord Thornfield. I believe you will find that most police investigations are more concerned with motive and opportunity than with peripheral financial irregularities, particularly when those irregularities do not appear to bear upon the matter directly at hand." "But surely," Hawthorne began to protest, "the financial arrangement provides me with a motive. If Lord Thornfield were to die, the arrangement would end, and my position would likely become untenable." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and it is precisely for that reason that our cooperation with the investigation will demonstrate that you are not the guilty party. A man who possessed sufficient foresight to conceal an incriminating motive would surely possess sufficient foresight to refrain from poisoning the man whose death would expose that motive to scrutiny. Therefore, your very involvement in these financial matters, when voluntarily disclosed, will serve as evidence of your innocence rather than as proof of your guilt." Hawthorne considered this reasoning for a long moment, and Miss Marple could see the visible struggle occurring within him as he attempted to decide whether to accept her assessment or to remain defensive. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You are correct, Miss Marple," he said. "I shall speak with the inspector tomorrow morning and provide him with a complete account of the arrangement. I am grateful for your counsel." After he had departed, Miss Marple resumed her seat and her knitting, but her mind was no longer focused upon the sweater taking shape beneath her needles. The information that Hawthorne had provided opened new avenues of inquiry. If Charles Thornfield suspected his father of financial impropriety, what might his motives have been? If Eleanor Ashford possessed knowledge of this situation through her intimacy with Charles, what use might she have made of that knowledge? And most intriguingly, how did Lord Thornfield's financial irregularities connect, if at all, to the attempted poisoning? It was becoming increasingly clear to Miss Marple that the peaceful village of Thornfield harbored far more secrets than the surface had suggested, and that the Christmas stocking containing poisoned bonbons was perhaps merely the most visible manifestation of far deeper tensions and resentments that had been accumulating beneath the surface of village life for considerably longer than anyone had previously acknowledged. The morning following Miss Marple's conversation with James Hawthorne arrived grey and cold, with a damp mist that clung to the gardens of Thornfield and obscured the distant hills beyond. Miss Marple descended to breakfast, to find that Charles had returned from the hospital sometime during the night, and he was now seated in the breakfast room with a cup of tea cooling before him. His attention apparently focused upon the window rather than upon the food that a sympathetic servant had placed within his reach. "Good morning, Mr. Thornfield," Miss Marple said, settling herself at the table with the careful deliberation of age. "I trust your father has continued to improve." Charles turned from the window with an expression that suggested he had not even registered her entrance until she spoke. "Yes," he said after a moment. "The doctors are quite satisfied with his progress. He slept well last night, and his breathing has improved considerably. They believe he should be discharged within a week, though he will require careful monitoring for some months." "How fortunate," Miss Marple observed, accepting a cup of tea from the servant. "And yet I perceive that you are yourself considerably troubled this morning. One might venture to guess that your father's physical recovery is not the primary source of your distress." Charles set down his teacup with a slight clatter. "You are very perceptive, Miss Marple. But then I suppose you have had considerable practice in observing the affairs of other people." There was a slight edge to his tone, a defensiveness that suggested he was aware on some level that his activities were the subject of general village speculation. "I confess that I am troubled, not merely by the poisoning attempt, but by what lies beneath it. I have discovered certain irregularities in the estate accounts that suggest my father has been engaged in financial practices of questionable legality. Ah, Miss Marple said, and her single syllable seemed to carry considerable weight. And it is this discovery that has occupied your thoughts during the night, I presume? Precisely, Charles confirmed. You see, when I returned from London, I began to examine the estate finances more closely, partly out of idle curiosity, and partly because I have been contemplating whether to leave my London position and involve myself more directly in the management of the property. What I discovered disturbed me greatly. There are gaps in the accounting, transfers of funds that do not appear to have corresponding documentation, and evidence of what I can only describe as systematic concealment of certain transactions. Miss Marple buttered a piece of toast with her characteristic precision. And you have discussed these discoveries with anyone else? I mentioned them to Eleanor Ashford, Charles admitted. We have become rather close during my stay, and I foolishly thought that sharing my concerns with her might help to clarify matters in my own mind. She was sympathetic, naturally, but she also suggested that I ought to approach Mr. Blackwell directly, as he manages the legal aspects of the estate and would be in the best position to advise me regarding the proper course of action. A sensible suggestion, Miss Marple observed. And have you acted upon it? Not yet, Charles said, and his hesitation suggested that there was more to be said upon the subject. You see, there is a complication. I discovered that James Hawthorne appears to have been involved in these transactions. There are payments to him that do not correspond to his normal salary, and there are entries in his handwriting that suggest his deliberate participation in the concealment. When I attempted to question him about it, he became defensive and refused to discuss the matter. I was beginning to suspect that perhaps he had attempted to poison my father in order to prevent the disclosure of their joint financial impropriety. And yet, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that theory presents certain difficulties, does it not? If your father were to die, Mr. Hawthorne's involvement would surely be discovered during the estate settlement, and the subsequent examination of the accounts. His silence would be maintained, if at all, only if your father were to survive. Charles paused, and it was evident that this particular aspect of the situation had not previously occurred to him with sufficient clarity. I had not considered it in precisely those terms, he admitted. Furthermore, Miss Marple continued, I believe that Mr. Hawthorne intends to speak with Inspector Morrison this morning regarding his involvement in these financial arrangements. A voluntary disclosure suggests a man attempting to clear his conscience rather than a man attempting to conceal guilt regarding a crime of violence. How do you know this? Charles asked, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely comfortable with the implication that Miss Marple possessed information that he had not shared with her. I have lived a considerable number of years, Miss Marple replied, during which I have observed that people frequently reveal themselves to those whom they believe will listen with a degree of sympathetic understanding. Mr. Hawthorne is a man troubled by his own actions, but those actions, while ethically questionable, do not appear to extend to attempted murder. Before Charles could respond, a servant entered to inform them that Inspector Morrison had arrived and was requesting to speak with Charles regarding the estate finances. Charles rose from the table with obvious reluctance and departed, leaving Miss Marple to continue her breakfast in solitude, her mind already occupied with the implications of the information she had gathered. By mid-morning, Inspector Morrison had completed his interview with Charles and had summoned James Hawthorne for a formal statement. Miss Marple observed from the drawing-room window as the inspector's constable escorted Hawthorne toward the study, the estate manager's expression suggesting a man approaching his own execution rather than merely a police interview. She wondered what revelations would emerge from that conversation, and whether they would illuminate or further obscure the central question that remained unanswered: who had placed the poisoned bonbons in Lord Thornfield's Christmas stocking. It was during this period of waiting that Eleanor Ashford arrived at Thornfield, ostensibly to inquire after Lord Thornfield's health, but, Miss Marple suspected, actually motivated by a desire to speak with Charles and to determine what, if anything, he had disclosed regarding their private conversations. Eleanor's arrival was marked by a barely concealed anxiety. Her hands trembled as she removed her gloves, and her eyes darted frequently toward the doorway as if she expected Charles to materialize from behind the furniture at any moment. "I trust Lord Thornfield is recovering well," Eleanor said, engaging Miss Marple in conversation with the sort of forced casualness that suggested she was attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy. It must have been quite dreadful for Lady Thornfield, discovering that poisoned bonbons had been placed in his stocking with such deliberate intent. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Though I confess that the matter has not yet been proven beyond dispute, it remains possible, however unlikely, that the bonbons were placed in the stocking through some accident or misunderstanding, rather than through deliberate malice. "Surely not," Eleanor said, and her vehemence suggested that she had given the matter considerable thought. One would have to be remarkably careless to include items containing nuts in a Christmas stocking when the recipient's allergy is so well known throughout the village. "No, Miss Marple, I am quite convinced that this was a deliberate attempt upon Lord Thornfield's life, conducted by someone who either wished him dead or wished to cause him considerable suffering." "And whom do you suspect might harbor such wishes?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Eleanor's face flushed, and she turned away toward the window. "I could not say," she replied, and her tone suggested that she could indeed say but had chosen, for reasons best known to herself, to refrain from doing so, though I imagine the inspector's investigation will eventually reveal the guilty party. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "though investigations, like many human endeavors, often uncover truths that were not anticipated at their commencement. Secrets have a way of emerging, even when one might prefer that they remained concealed. And sometimes those secrets prove to be entirely unrelated to the crime that initially prompted their disclosure." Eleanor turned back to face Miss Marple, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure seemed to falter. It was a moment of vulnerability, revealing something beneath the surface that Eleanor appeared to be desperately attempting to conceal. But before Miss Marple could pursue the matter further, Charles appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting that he had been informed of Eleanor's arrival and had come to greet her. As Miss Marple observed the interaction between Charles and Eleanor, she noted numerous small details. The way Eleanor's face seemed to light upon seeing him, only to immediately shadow with concern. The manner in which Charles took her hand with apparent affection but without the spontaneous joe. Why, that one might expect. The nervous glances that they exchanged, as if they were attempting to communicate something of importance without speaking directly. Whatever relationship had developed between Charles and Eleanor, it carried with it a significant burden of anxiety and unresolved tension. It was becoming increasingly apparent to Miss Marple that the attempted poisoning was not a simple crime of passion or impulse, but rather the culmination of a complex web of relationships, secrets, and motivations that had been woven over months or perhaps years. The Christmas stocking had been merely the vehicle through which this culmination had been expressed, but the genuine source of the crime lay deeper, hidden beneath layers of social propriety and village convention. And Miss Marple, with her decades of experience in observing human nature, was beginning to perceive the outlines of that deeper truth, though its precise contours remained, for the moment, obscured by shadow and conjecture. The afternoon light was beginning its premature descent into evening when Inspector Morrison requested that Miss Marple join him in Lord Thornfield's study for what he described as a consultation regarding certain observations she had made during the course of the day. She found him seated behind the mahogany desk, surrounded by papers and various items that had been carefully catalogued and labeled as evidence. His expression suggested a man who had gathered considerable information but who remained uncertain regarding the precise manner in which that information should be interpreted. "Miss Marple," he began, gesturing for her to take the chair opposite his own, "I find myself in a somewhat unusual position. Throughout my career in police work, I have learned to place considerable confidence in the observations and deductions of experienced individuals, even when those observations do not immediately conform to the apparent evidence. Your reputation in such matters is well established, and I wonder if you might assist me in understanding certain aspects of this case that continue to perplex me." "I shall certainly endeavor to do so," Miss Marple replied, settling herself with the careful deliberation of age. though I must confess that my observations are often merely the product of a considerable number of years spent observing the patterns of human behavior in small communities such as St. Mary Mead. I cannot claim any particular expertise that would not be available to someone of sufficient patience and attention to detail. Inspector Morrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him in an attitude of contemplation. Let us begin with the Christmas stocking itself. The bonbons were placed within it, and they were clearly intended for Lord Thornfield's consumption. Yet the method employed suggests neither panic nor impulse. The perpetrator took considerable time and care to obtain specialized bonbons containing nuts, to package them in a manner that would not immediately reveal their contents, and to place them in a position where they would be discovered by Lord Thornfield at a time and place where medical assistance would be readily available. Is that not somewhat unusual? Most unusual indeed, Miss Marple agreed. In fact, one might venture to suggest that the perpetrator may not have intended the poisoning to result in Lord Thornfield's death, but rather to cause him considerable suffering, or to serve as a warning of some kind. That thought had occurred to me, the inspector admitted, though it is difficult to imagine a scenario in which one might wish to poison someone without desiring that poison to prove fatal. Yet you seem to suggest that possibility with considerable confidence. I do so, Miss Marple said, because the choice of poison and method demonstrates a certain knowledge and consideration that would be inconsistent with a genuine desire for murder. Had the perpetrator wished Lord Thornfield dead, there would have been numerous more effective methods available. The use of nuts, which merely cause severe allergic reaction rather than death, suggests an intention more aligned with the infliction of fear or pain rather than the termination of life. Inspector Morrison made a notation in his book. And the perpetrator's knowledge of Lord Thornfield's allergy? That is also significant, Miss Marple continued. The allergy is not, as Mr. Blackwell suggested yesterday, entirely unknown throughout the village. However, it is not the sort of information that would be widely circulated among casual acquaintances. The perpetrator would necessarily be someone who either possessed direct knowledge of Lord Thornfield's medical history or who was sufficiently intimate with the family to be aware of such matters, which narrows our circle of suspects considerably, the inspector observed. We may therefore eliminate the possibility that this was the work of some external party seeking revenge for past wrongs. The perpetrator must be someone within the village, someone with access to Thornfield House, and someone with sufficient knowledge of Lord Thornfield's personal vulnerabilities to employ them as a weapon. Precisely so, Miss Marple said. Furthermore, the perpetrator must have possessed access to Lady Thornfield's sitting room during the 3-day period in which the stockings were being prepared. This suggests someone who either resides at Thornfield or who has sufficient familiarity with the household to move about without arousing suspicion. I have interviewed all members of the household staff, Inspector Morrison said, consulting his notes. None of them report observing any unusual activity in Lady Thornfield's sitting room, nor do any of them recall strangers entering the house during the relevant period. The servants are generally quite observant regarding such matters, as they necessarily must be, in order to maintain household security and propriety. And yet, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, servants are frequently remarkably unobservant regarding the activities of persons whom they consider to be their social equals or superiors. A family member or a frequent guest moving about the house would not necessarily attract the notice that would be given to an unfamiliar person or someone of obviously lower social station. Inspector Morrison leaned forward with evident interest. You are suggesting that the perpetrator is someone from within the family circle or among the regular guests? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that the perpetrator is someone whose presence in the house would not be considered unusual or worthy of remark, someone whose access to the upper floors and to Lady Thornfield's sitting room would be taken for granted rather than questioned. The inspector rose from his chair and began to pace the study, his mind clearly working through the implications of Miss Marple's observations. That would suggest Charles Thornfield, who returned home approximately 3 weeks ago. It would also suggest Eleanor Ashford, who has apparently been spending considerable time at the house during Charles's stay. It might even suggest Mrs. Patricia Ashford, who is sufficiently close to the family to perhaps be granted such access. It would suggest those persons among others, Miss Marple agreed. However, I would advise caution regarding the assumption that access necessarily implies guilt. There may be other considerations that should be examined before one settles upon a particular suspect as the likely perpetrator. Such as? The inspector inquired. Such as the question of motive, Miss Marple replied. What possible reason might each of these individuals have for wishing to poison Lord Thornfield? We have already established that Charles has discovered financial irregularities in the estate accounts. Eleanor Ashford appears to harbour some attachment to Charles, and she may have been motivated by a desire to assist him or to remove obstacles to their relationship. But what of the others? What possible motive might drive Mrs. Ashford to such an action? Inspector Morrison resumed his seat and made several more notations. I confess that I have not yet established a clear motive for Mrs. Ashford. She appears to be on cordial terms with Lord and Lady Thornfield, and there is no obvious financial incentive for such an action. Yet she was present at the luncheon. She had the opportunity to access the house, and she possesses the requisite knowledge of Lord Thornfield's allergy. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and yet one must consider whether opportunity and knowledge are truly sufficient to establish guilt. In my experience, even the most careful criminal requires a compelling motive, and without that motive, the crime itself remains incomplete and unconvincing. At that moment, there came a knock upon the study door, and Sergeant Blake entered with a message that caused the inspector's expression to shift noticeably. He excused himself and departed with his sergeant, leaving Miss Marple alone in the study with her thoughts and observations. She rose and moved toward the window, gazing out at the darkening gardens where the mist was beginning to gather once more. She was aware, with a sort of certainty that came from long experience, that the solution to this puzzle lay not in the accumulation of facts or the establishment of opportunity, but rather in the careful examination of human emotion and the recognition of patterns that repeated themselves across the years and circumstances of village life. Someone in this house harbored a secret so significant that they had been willing to risk attempted murder in order to protect it. Someone was so desperate, so afraid, so motivated by something deeper than mere financial gain or romantic attachment, that they had taken the risk of poisoning Lord Thornfield's Christmas stocking. Miss Marple's knitting needles had been left in her room, but she found herself going through the motions of knitting in her mind, the methodical rhythm helping to organize her thoughts. There was a pattern here, emerging gradually from the chaos of events and revelations, and if she could but perceive that pattern clearly, if she could but understand the true connections between the various individuals and their relationships to Lord Thornfield, then perhaps the guilty party would reveal itself not through confession or confrontation, but through the simple weight of accumulated truth and the impossibility of maintaining their carefully constructed deception in the face of such overwhelming evidence of motive and opportunity combined. The revelation that prompted Inspector Morrison's hurried departure proved, when disclosed to the assembled household some hours later, to be of considerable significance. The bonbons that had been placed in Lord Thornfield's Christmas stocking had been purchased, according to the inspector's investigations, from an exclusive confectioner's establishment in Bath, a shop that maintained careful records of its clientele and their purchases. More specifically, the particular batch of almond bonbons that had nearly killed Lord Thornfield had been purchased 3 weeks prior to Christmas by an individual who had paid for them in cash, but whose description matched, in considerable detail, that of Charles Thornfield. The revelation sent a visible shock through the household. Charles, confronted with this information in the presence of his mother and Miss Marple, had vehemently denied the accusation, insisting that while he may have visited Bath on a shopping expedition during the relevant time frame, he had most certainly not purchased poisoned bonbons with the intention of harming his father. Inspector Morrison, however, possessed something more than mere circumstantial evidence. He produced a receipt, purchased from a haberdashery adjacent to the confectioner's shop, that bore Charles's name, and that had been dated to the exact day upon which the bonbons had been acquired. "I purchased a new waistcoat," Charles explained, his voice rising in pitch as panic began to overtake his initial indignation. The receipt proves I was in Bath that day. But it does not prove that I purchased the bonbons. Anyone could have purchased them, and the confectioner's description of the customer was vague at best. He could have been describing any number of young men. Yet even as Charles protested, Miss Marple observed something that caused her considerable concern. Eleanor Ashford, seated in the corner of the drawing-room with her mother beside her, had gone very pale. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her eyes darted frequently toward Charles, as if she were attempting to communicate something of vital importance through sheer force of will. And Mrs. Ashford, for her part, had placed a restraining hand upon her daughter's arm, a gesture that suggested she was attempting to prevent Eleanor from saying something that both of them knew she was on the verge of utterance. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, into the tense silence that had followed Charles's protest, "that there may be certain complications regarding this matter that the inspector has not yet fully appreciated." Inspector Morrison turned toward her with evident curiosity, mingled with a degree of caution that suggested he had learned from previous interactions that Miss Marple's observations frequently contained insights that his own investigation had failed to uncover. "You have something to contribute, Miss Marple." "I do," she confirmed, "though I confess that what I have to contribute consists less of definitive evidence and more of certain observations regarding the behavior and demeanor of the persons present in this room. If I may be permitted to speak freely." "Please do," the inspector invited, and he settled back into his chair with an expression suggesting he was prepared to listen with considerable attention. "It occurs to me," Miss Marple began, "that the purchase of the bonbons in Bath is significant, not because it necessarily implicates Charles Thornfield in the poisoning, but rather because it raises the question of why anyone would purchase such items in Bath when they could be obtained far more conveniently through London establishments or through agents in London known to Charles through his residence there. Furthermore, the confectioner in Bath is not a particularly well-known establishment, nor is it the sort of shop that one would naturally visit unless one had specific knowledge of its location and reputation." "What are you suggesting?" Charles demanded, his voice sharp with anxiety. "I am suggesting," Miss Marple continued, "that someone wished to create the appearance that you had purchased the bonbons, either by deliberately imitating your appearance or by utilizing a receipt that could be attributed to you. The question then becomes, who would benefit from such a deception, and who possessed the knowledge and opportunity to create such a false attribution?" Eleanor Ashford suddenly rose from her seat, her composure shattered entirely. "I cannot remain silent any longer," she declared, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mother, I must speak, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor, sit down at once," Mrs. Ashford commanded, her tone carrying the weight of maternal authority. But Eleanor shook her head and turned toward Inspector Morrison with the expression of someone about to make a confession that would fundamentally alter the course of events. "The truth is," Eleanor said, her words tumbling out in a rush that suggested long suppression, "that I purchased those bonbons. I went to Bath specifically to acquire them, using the receipt from Charles's waistcoat purchase, which I had observed in his room when he was otherwise occupied. I intended to frame him for the poisoning because I believed that if he were arrested and convicted, his mother would finally understand that he is not suited to manage the estate or to inherit the family responsibilities that have been placed upon him." The silence that followed this confession was absolute and suffocating. Mrs. Ashford had closed her eyes, and her hand had fallen from Eleanor's arm as if she no longer possessed the strength to maintain even that minimal physical contact. Charles stared at Eleanor with an expression that combined betrayal, confusion, and a dawning comprehension of the depths of deception that had surrounded him. "But why," Miss Marple asked gently, "would you wish to harm Lord Thornfield himself? Surely your desire to incriminate Charles need not have required that his father be placed in mortal danger." Eleanor's face crumpled, and she sank back into her chair as if the effort of confession had completely exhausted her remaining reserves of strength. "I did not intend to harm him," she said, her voice barely audible. "I believed that the allergic reaction would be frightening but not truly dangerous, given that medical assistance would be immediately available. I thought that the shock and fear would be sufficient to accomplish my purposes without requiring actual death. And what purposes were those precisely? Inspector Morrison inquired, his professional tone suggesting that he was attempting to maintain some degree of detachment from the emotional turmoil surrounding him. It was Miss Marple, however, who answered the question. Miss Ashford believes that Charles Thornfield harbors romantic intentions that she hopes to discourage by demonstrating his unsuitability for the responsibilities that would accompany such a relationship. Is that not correct? She turned toward Eleanor with an expression of sympathetic understanding. Eleanor nodded miserably, and then the words began to pour out in an almost uncontrollable torrent. Charles has been away in London for 3 years, building a life entirely separate from the village and his family obligations. But when he returned, he seemed different, as if he had discovered something in London that made him question his previous priorities. He began spending time with me, and I began to hope that perhaps he might wish to remain in the village, to involve himself with the estate management, to build a life here rather than retreating to London. She paused, struggling visibly with emotion. But I realized over the course of these past weeks that he was only temporarily home, that his heart remained in London, with the life and the person he has constructed there. He was kind to me out of affection and out of a sense of familial obligation, but he was never truly committed to remaining, and I could not bear the thought of watching him depart once more, knowing that I had allowed myself to harbor such foolish hopes. So you decided to frame him for attempted murder, Inspector Morrison said flatly. That was your method of encouraging him to remain in the village? I thought, Eleanor said desperately, that if he were arrested, if he were placed in a position where his future was threatened, perhaps he would finally understand the gravity of his choices. Perhaps he would recognize that there were people here who cared about him, who needed him. I did not wish to harm Lord Thornfield. I wished to create a situation that would force Charles to confront his responsibilities and his relationships in a more honest manner. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, and her expression carried a sadness that seemed to encompass not merely Eleanor's confession, but the broader tragedy of human emotion and delusion that had led to this moment. What you have done, she said to Eleanor, is not merely to commit a crime, though that is certainly true. You have also destroyed the very relationship that you sought to preserve. Whatever affection Charles may have felt for you, whatever possibility may have existed for a genuine connection between you, has now been irretrievably damaged by your actions. You have learned, I fear, a lesson that many people learn too late, that love based upon deception and manipulation cannot survive the inevitable revelation of truth. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mrs. Ashford moved toward her daughter, and for a moment it seemed as if she would offer comfort, but instead she merely placed a hand upon Eleanor's shoulder in a gesture that conveyed disappointment and resignation rather than maternal forgiveness. Inspector Morrison signaled to Sergeant Blake, who stepped forward with handcuffs and began to read Eleanor her rights in the formal manner prescribed by law. As Eleanor was led from the drawing-room, she did not look back at Charles, nor did she seem to be aware of anything beyond the immediate reality of her own downfall and the consequences that would necessarily follow. Yet even as Eleanor was being removed from the house, Miss Marple found her mind returning to the original question that had prompted this entire investigation. Eleanor had confessed to purchasing the bonbons and to placing them in Lord Thornfield's stocking, but something about the confession did not sit entirely comfortably with Miss Marple's understanding of human psychology and motivation. Eleanor's explanation was logical, her confession appeared sincere, and yet there remained, buried beneath the surface, an inconsistency that suggested the truth was somewhat more complicated than had been thus far revealed. The arrest of Eleanor Ashford should have brought closure to the investigation, and indeed Inspector Morrison appeared satisfied that the primary perpetrator had been identified and secured in custody, pending formal charges. Yet Miss Marple found herself unable to dismiss entirely the nagging sense of incompleteness that had attached itself to the resolution of events. She spent the evening in her guest room at Thornfield, her knitting needles clicking their familiar rhythm, while her mind worked through the inconsistencies that continued to trouble her. The confession had been too neat, too convenient, and most troublingly, too willing. Eleanor had admitted her guilt with a rapidity that suggested either genuine remorse or a carefully constructed performance designed to achieve a specific outcome. Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize the difference between authentic contrition and the calculated performance of remorse, and Eleanor's confession had carried about it certain qualities that suggested the latter interpretation might not be entirely without merit. Furthermore, there remained the question of how Eleanor had obtained access to Lady Thornfield's sitting room during the 3-day period in which the stockings were being prepared. Eleanor was a frequent visitor to the house, certainly, but her presence would not necessarily go unremarked by the servants, particularly if she had been observed entering areas of the house that were not typically the subject of guests' perambulations. Yet, when Miss Marple had inquired of the servants regarding Eleanor's visits during the relevant period, their responses had been vague and uncertain, suggesting either a genuine lack of observation or a deliberate obscuring of the truth. It was late in the evening, as Miss Marple was preparing to retire, that she received an unexpected visitor. James Hawthorne appeared at her door with an expression of considerable agitation, and he requested in hushed tones that she might join him briefly in the library, where they would not be overheard by other members of the household. "Miss Marple," he began, once they were seated behind the closed door of the library, "I must speak with you regarding Eleanor Ashford's confession. I believe there are certain aspects of that confession that do not align with the facts as I understand them." "I am listening," Miss Marple said, settling herself with interest. "When Eleanor claimed that she had placed the bonbons in Lord Thornfield's stocking," Hawthorne continued, "she was speaking truthfully regarding that fact. However, she did not place them there during the 3 days in which Lady Thornfield was preparing the stockings. She placed them there on the morning of Boxing Day, after the stockings had been brought downstairs and before the guests had arrived at the house." "How do you come to possess this knowledge?" Miss Marple inquired. "Because I observed her," Hawthorne replied. "I arrived early that morning to ensure that all preparations for the luncheon had been completed properly. I saw Eleanor enter the dining room through the garden door, and I watched as she opened Lord Thornfield's stocking and inserted the box of bonbons. I was too shocked to act immediately, and by the time I had processed what I had witnessed, she had already departed." "And why did you not immediately inform the inspector of this observation?" Miss Marple asked. Hawthorne's face flushed with embarrassment. "Because I feared that any involvement on my part in the investigation would lead to the revelation of my financial involvement with Lord Thornfield. I reasoned that the truth would eventually emerge, and that my silence would not ultimately alter the outcome. It was cowardly, I confess, but I was motivated by self-preservation rather than by any desire to protect Eleanor." Miss Marple considered this revelation carefully. If Eleanor had indeed placed the bonbons in the stocking on the morning of Boxing Day, then the entire timeline of the crime would necessarily shift. It would mean that Eleanor had carried the bonbons to Thornfield on that morning, which required that she have made prior arrangements for their acquisition and transportation. It also meant that she had acted with deliberate premeditation, rather than with the sort of impulsive decisiveness that her confession had suggested. "This information alters the character of the crime considerably," Miss Marple observed. "It suggests that Eleanor's actions were not merely motivated by romantic disappointment, but by a more calculated intention to frame Charles for a crime that she herself was committing. That requires a degree of psychological sophistication and planning that Miss Ashford may or may not possess." "There is something else," Hawthorne said hesitantly. "When I observed Eleanor placing the bonbons in the stocking, she was not acting alone. There was another person with her, someone who remained partially obscured by the doorway, but whom I could identify with reasonable certainty." "And who was that person?" Miss Marple inquired, though some inner instinct suggested she could already anticipate the answer. "It was Mrs. Patricia Ashford," Hawthorne said quietly. "Eleanor's mother. She appeared to be directing Eleanor's actions, indicating precisely where the bonbons should be placed and ensuring that the task was completed properly. When I consider this information in conjunction with Eleanor's subsequent confession, I believe that Mrs. Ashford may have been the true architect of this poisoning attempt." while Eleanor merely served as the instrument through which that intention was executed. The implications of this revelation settled upon Miss Marple like a heavy cloak. Eleanor's confession, viewed through this new lens, took on an entirely different character. She had confessed to the crime not out of remorse or a desire to protect Charles, but rather out of a misguided loyalty to her mother, accepting upon herself the full weight of guilt in order to shield Mrs. Ashford from the consequences of her actions. "I believe you are correct," Miss Marple said slowly, "and I believe I now understand what has motivated Mrs. Ashford to undertake such a desperate action. Tell me, Mr. Hawthorne, what was the nature of the financial arrangement between yourself and Lord Thornfield? Was it limited merely to the concealment of certain transactions, or did it extend to something more substantial?" Hawthorne was silent for a long moment before responding. "There were land transactions involved," he admitted finally. "Certain parcels of the Thornfield estate were to be sold, ostensibly to meet financial obligations, but the proceeds were to be divided between Lord Thornfield and myself, with Mr. Blackwell remaining unaware of the sales. The transactions were relatively recent, occurring within the past 18 months. And who was the purchaser of these land parcels?" Miss Marple asked, though once again she believed she could anticipate the answer. "The purchaser was a development company based in London," Hawthorne replied. "They intended to develop the land for residential housing. However, the transaction became complicated when it became apparent that one of the parcels was subject to certain legal encumbrances that the development company had not anticipated. These encumbrances related to rights of access and usage that had been granted to certain local residents many years ago, and they significantly reduced the value and utility of the land for the development company's purposes. And was Mrs. Ashford one of those individuals who possessed such rights?" Miss Marple inquired. "She was," Hawthorne confirmed. "Her late husband had negotiated those rights decades ago, as part of a settlement following a boundary dispute with Lord Thornfield's father. When the current development situation arose, she refused to waive those rights, believing that the land should not be developed for commercial purposes. This refusal placed her in direct conflict with Lord Thornfield, who was motivated by financial considerations and who became increasingly angry regarding her obstruction of the transaction." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the window, gazing out at the darkness beyond. "So Mrs. Ashford," she said thoughtfully, "confronted Lord Thornfield regarding his intention to proceed with the land sale despite her objections. That confrontation must have resulted in considerable acrimony and conflict, and at some point during their dispute, it became apparent to Mrs. Ashford that Lord Thornfield was sufficiently motivated by financial gain that he would pursue the transaction regardless of her protests or her legal rights." "That is precisely the situation," Hawthorne confirmed. "Mrs. Ashford came to me approximately 2 weeks before the poisoning attempt and demanded that I reveal to her the extent of my involvement in Lord Thornfield's financial arrangements. She seemed to believe that if she could demonstrate that Lord Thornfield was engaged in unethical or illegal transactions, she might be able to leverage that information to prevent the land sale from proceeding. And when you refused to provide her with that information?" Miss Marple asked. "She became extremely angry," Hawthorne admitted. "She seemed to undergo a transformation from a reasoned and composed woman into someone consumed by rage and a desire for revenge. She began to speak of Lord Thornfield in the most vindictive terms, expressing a wish that he would be removed from the situation entirely, either through death or through incapacitation that would prevent him from pursuing the transaction." Miss Marple turned back from the window to face Hawthorne directly. "Mrs. Ashford did not merely wish to harm Lord Thornfield," she said. "She wished to destroy him entirely. The poisoning attempt was not intended merely to teach him a lesson or to frighten him into abandoning the land sale. It was intended to result in his death, or at minimum in his hospitalization and incapacitation for an extended period of time. And in involving Eleanor in the crime, Mrs. Ashford was not merely using her daughter as an instrument of her will. She was also ensuring that Eleanor would be complicit in the crime, thereby securing her daughter's silence and loyalty through the shared burden of guilt." "That is a devastating assessment," Hawthorne said quietly. "But an accurate one, I fear," Miss Marple replied. and it suggests that Eleanor's confession, while technically truthful regarding her actions, was fundamentally incomplete regarding her motivations and the true nature of her involvement in this crime. She is guilty, certainly, but she is guilty primarily of filial loyalty and a tragic misunderstanding of her mother's character and intentions. The true perpetrator of this poisoning attempt is Mrs. Patricia Ashford, and it is she who must face the full consequences of her actions. The revelation that Mrs. Patricia Ashford was the true architect of the poisoning attempt necessitated a rapid series of developments within the investigation. Inspector Morrison, upon receiving Miss Marple's analysis and Hawthorne's corroborating testimony, obtained a warrant to conduct a thorough search of Mrs. Ashford's residence. The search revealed, among other items of significance, correspondence between Mrs. Ashford and a London chemist that detailed the acquisition of concentrated nut extracts under the pretense of conducting culinary experiments. More damning still, there were drafts of letters, never sent, in which Mrs. Ashford had articulated her rage toward Lord Thornfield in language so violent and so explicit that even the inspector appeared somewhat startled by the depths of her animosity. When confronted with this evidence, Mrs. Ashford's composure finally fractured. She had maintained throughout the initial investigation a facade of concerned concern for Eleanor and sympathetic dismay regarding the poisoning attempt. But faced with the undeniable proof of her own involvement, she abandoned all pretense of innocence and instead launched into a tirade that revealed the psychological state that had motivated her actions. "He deserved it," she declared, her voice rising to an almost uncontrollable pitch. "He deserved far worse than what I planned for him. That man has spent his entire life pursuing profit at the expense of everything that is right and proper. He stole from his own tenants, he cheated his business partners, and when I stood in his way, when I attempted to prevent him from destroying the last vestige of the landscape that my husband fought to preserve, he threatened me. He actually threatened me, suggesting that he would use his influence and resources to ensure that my legal rights were rendered meaningless." "So you decided to poison him," Inspector Morrison said flatly. "I decided," Mrs. Ashford corrected, "to remove him from a position where he could cause further harm. Was that wrong? Was it wrong to wish to stop a man who had spent decades accumulating wealth and power through methods that would shame most people? I did not wish to kill him, merely to incapacitate him, to force him to confront the consequences of his actions, to ensure that justice was served by means that the legal system had proven incapable of providing. You endangered not only Lord Thornfield, but your own daughter," Inspector Morrison observed. "You involved Eleanor in a serious crime and allowed her to accept responsibility for actions that were primarily your own. That suggests a level of moral culpability that extends far beyond the poisoning attempt itself." Mrs. Ashford's expression shifted, and for a moment something like genuine remorse seemed to flicker across her features. "Eleanor," she said quietly, and then again with greater emphasis, "Eleanor, I did not intend for her to be implicated. I believed that I would conduct the poisoning myself, that I would place the bonbons in the stocking, and that when the crime was investigated, suspicion would naturally fall upon Charles, given his recent return from London and his discovery of the financial irregularities. Eleanor was to know nothing of the matter. And yet," Miss Marple interjected, "having been invited by Inspector Morrison to participate in the interrogation, Eleanor became involved through no decision of your own. She discovered the bonbons, she understood their purpose, and she voluntarily assumed responsibility for their placement in Lord Thornfield's stocking. Why do you suppose she did so?" Mrs. Ashford turned toward Miss Marple with an expression of profound anguish. "She did so because she loves Charles Thornfield, and she believed that by framing him for the crime, she could somehow force him to recognize her worth, to remain in T Village, to build a life with her, rather than returning to London. She created an elaborate fantasy in which his arrest and conviction would somehow result in his eventual gratitude and affection. It was the fantasy of a lonely and desperate young woman, and I failed to recognize it until it was far too late to prevent her from acting upon it." "But you knew," Miss Marple said gently, "that Eleanor was involved. When you observed her placing the bonbons in the stocking on the morning of Boxing Day, you understood that she had interpreted your actions and decided to participate in your crime." And instead of stopping her, instead of withdrawing from your own plan and protecting your daughter from the consequences of such involvement, you allowed her to proceed. Why? The question hung in the air like a blade, and Mrs. Ashford seemed to shrivel beneath its weight. "Because," she said finally, her voice barely audible. At that moment, I realized that my own rage had consumed me entirely. I had become a woman driven by vengeance and anger, and I could not stop, even when the opportunity presented itself. I could not withdraw from the crime that I had planned, even to spare my own daughter from its consequences. That is perhaps the most shameful revelation of all, Miss Marple. I was so consumed by my desire to harm Lord Thornfield that I was willing to sacrifice my daughter's future in order to satisfy that desire. Inspector Morrison signalled to Sergeant Blake, and Mrs. Ashford was formally placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault and aggravated endangerment. As she was led away by the constables, Eleanor, who had been present in an adjacent room during the interrogation, emerged with tears streaming down her face. She moved toward her mother, seemingly wishing to offer some final gesture of connection or comfort, but Mrs. Ashford turned away, unwilling or unable to accept such comfort from the daughter she had involved in her crime. The departure of both mother and daughter left a peculiar void in the household. Charles Thornfield, vindicated but traumatized by the revelation of Eleanor's obsessive devotion and her willingness to frame him for a serious crime, appeared diminished by the experience. He spent much of the following day seated in the library with a glass of whiskey, speaking to no one, his earlier anger at Eleanor seemingly having metamorphosed into something more complicated and perhaps more devastating, a profound sense of guilt regarding his own role in encouraging her affections, while maintaining emotional distance from her. Young people, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Morrison, as they stood in the drawing-room late in the afternoon of Eleanor's arrest, are frequently the victims of their own romantic imaginings. They construct elaborate narratives regarding relationships and futures that exist only in their own minds, and they become so invested in these narratives that they lose the ability to perceive reality as it actually exists. Eleanor believed herself to be in love with Charles, and she believed that her love was reciprocated, despite considerable evidence to the contrary. When confronted with the truth, she seems to have responded by attempting to force reality to conform to her fantasy, resulting in criminal behavior that will haunt her for the remainder of her life. "Do you believe she will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law?" the inspector inquired. "I believe she will be," Miss Marple replied, "though I would hope that the courts would take into consideration her youth, her clear emotional disturbance, and her apparent genuine remorse regarding her actions. She is guilty, certainly, but she is also a victim of circumstances and psychological forces that were largely beyond her control." The formal conclusion of the investigation into the poisoning attempt at Thornfield came some 10 days after Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford had been taken into custody. Lord Thornfield, having recovered sufficiently from his allergic reaction, returned home from the hospital to find his estate transformed by the intrusions of criminal investigation and the disruptions caused by the revelation of his own financial improprieties. Inspector Morrison had concluded his preliminary inquiries and prepared his report for the Crown Prosecution Service, which would determine the precise charges to be brought against both Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford. It was during this period of formal closure that Miss Marple received a visitor in her guest room at Thornfield. Charles Thornfield, appearing considerably more composed than he had in the days immediately following the arrest, requested that they might speak together regarding certain matters that had occupied his thoughts. Miss Marple, perceiving that the young man required counsel and understanding rather than judgment, agreed to listen to what he had to say. "I have been attempting to comprehend," Charles began, settling himself in the chair opposite Miss Marple's own, "how I could have been so entirely blind to Eleanor's emotional state. She attempted to frame me for a serious crime, and yet I find myself experiencing not anger but rather a profound sense of guilt regarding my own role in encouraging her misguided affections." "It is a common enough phenomenon," Miss Marple observed gently. "Young men frequently fail to recognize that their ordinary courtesies and attentions may be interpreted by others as tokens of romantic commitment. You were kind to Miss Ashford. You spent time in her company. You listened to her thoughts and opinions. To her, these ordinary gestures of civility were transformed into evidence of love and the promise of a future together. When she perceived that you did not share her expectations, rather than accepting the disappointment, she attempted to manufacture a circumstance that would somehow justify her hopes. "But that does not absolve me of responsibility," Charles protested. "I knew, on some level, that her affections ran deeper than friendship. I chose to ignore that knowledge because I did not wish to confront the unpleasantness of disappointing her. I was cowardly, perhaps," Miss Marple conceded. "And yet, one cannot be held responsible for the interpretations and actions of others, no matter how misguided those interpretations may be. What you are experiencing now is the natural consequence of confronting the reality that your kindness had unintended consequences. That is painful, certainly, but it is also a necessary component of moral development. You will emerge from this experience as a more thoughtful and careful person, and you will likely be considerably more attentive to the emotional implications of your interactions with others in the future." Charles seemed to take some measure of comfort from this assessment, though the shadow of guilt did not entirely lift from his features. He departed shortly thereafter, and Miss Marple returned to her observation of the household and its gradual return to some semblance of normalcy. It was Lord Thornfield himself who requested Miss Marple's presence in his study the following morning. He had remained hospitalized longer than strictly necessary, partly because of the severity of his allergic reaction and partly, Miss Marple suspected, because he had wished to avoid the embarrassing confrontation with the reality of his own criminality that awaited him at home. James Hawthorne had already disclosed the full extent of their financial arrangement to the authorities, and Mr. Blackwell had been informed of the various irregularities that had been discovered in the estate accounts. "I owe you a considerable debt of gratitude, Miss Marple," Lord Thornfield began, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested the events of the past weeks had aged him considerably. "Without your insights and observations, the investigation might have concluded with the conviction of an innocent young woman, while the true perpetrators of this crime escaped justice. I merely observed what was present and attempted to draw reasonable conclusions from the evidence," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess that the case presented considerable complexities that required considerable thought to unravel satisfactorily." "You are being characteristically modest," Lord Thornfield said. "However, I wish to speak with you regarding a matter of considerably greater personal significance. Your investigation and the subsequent revelations have forced me to confront the reality of my own behavior and the consequences that behavior has had upon those around me. I have spent the better part of my life pursuing financial gain and the accumulation of wealth, often at the expense of ethical considerations and the legitimate rights of others. That is a recognition that many people never achieve," Miss Marple observed, "though I confess that it generally requires a traumatic event or a profound personal crisis to precipitate such recognition." "Indeed," Lord Thornfield agreed, "and I have determined that I shall use whatever years remain to me to make what amends I can for my previous actions. I have instructed Mr. Blackwell to cancel the land sale transaction that was at the heart of my dispute with Mrs. Ashford. That land will remain part of the Thornfield estate, and Mrs. Ashford's rights regarding its use and preservation will be scrupulously maintained. Furthermore, I intend to make a substantial financial contribution to the legal defense fund that has been established for Eleanor Ashford's trial. While I cannot absolve her of responsibility for her actions, I recognize that my own behavior contributed to the circumstances that led her to commit those actions." "A generous and thoughtful resolution," Miss Marple said, "though I would suggest that your generosity toward Mrs. Ashford's daughter may be perceived by some as an attempt to purchase forgiveness or to minimize the significance of what occurred. True recompense for past wrongs often requires not merely financial contribution but a fundamental alteration in one's character and subsequent behavior." Lord Thornfield nodded slowly, and it was evident that Miss Marple's observation had struck home with considerable force. "You are correct, of course," he said. "I cannot undo the harm that has been done, nor can I purchase redemption through financial gestures alone. I must ensure that my remaining years are conducted with considerably greater attention to ethical considerations and with a genuine commitment to the welfare of those who depend upon me for their livelihood and security. As Miss Marple departed from Lord Thornfield's study, she found herself reflecting upon the curious manner in which violence and crime sometimes served as instruments through which necessary transformations could occur. Had the poisoning attempt not occurred, Lord Thornfield would likely have continued indefinitely in his patterns of ethical compromise and financial manipulation. Mrs. Ashford would have continued to harbour her resentment and her rage, ultimately perhaps destroying herself through the accumulation of bitterness and unresolved anger. Eleanor would have continued to nurture her obsessive attachment to Charles, gradually becoming more embittered as the reality of his indifference became increasingly impossible to deny. The poisoning attempt had interrupted these trajectories and forced each of the principal actors in this drama to confront the reality of their own situation and their own role in the circumstances that surrounded them. Whether such confrontation would ultimately result in genuine transformation or merely in a temporary performance of remorse remained to be seen, but at minimum, the possibility for change had been created where previously there had existed only the stagnant continuation of existing patterns and behaviors. The trial of Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford took place in the county courthouse some 6 weeks following the arrests, and it attracted considerably more attention than might have been anticipated for what appeared to be a relatively straightforward case of attempted assault and conspiracy. The local newspapers had seized upon the story with considerable enthusiasm, transforming the quiet village scandal into a matter of broader social and moral significance. The trial became, in the eyes of the press and the public, less about the specific crime and more about the larger questions of justice, motivation, and the proper boundaries of maternal authority and filial loyalty. Eleanor's defense attorney had attempted to argue that she had been acting under duress and under the influence of her mother's dominant personality, a defense that might have carried considerably more weight had Eleanor not voluntarily confessed to her role in the poisoning, and had she not maintained, even during cross-examination, that her actions had been motivated primarily by her own romantic obsessions rather than by maternal coercion. The prosecution had therefore secured convictions against Eleanor for conspiracy and aggravated assault, crimes that carried sentences of considerable severity. Mrs. Ashford, by contrast, had maintained her innocence throughout the trial, a positive. On that was quickly undermined by the substantial evidence that had been gathered regarding her acquisition of the nut extracts and her correspondence with Eleanor detailing the logistics of the poisoning attempt. The jury had required less than 3 hours of deliberation before returning guilty verdicts on charges of conspiracy, attempted murder, and endangerment of a minor, offenses that carried the potential for substantial imprisonment. It was following the conclusion of the trial that Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the case with the sort of detached, philosophical perspective that came only with considerable passage of time and distance from the events themselves. She had returned to St. Mary Mead some 2 weeks after Eleanor's initial arrest, and she had resumed her ordinary life in the village with the resilience and adaptability that age and experience had cultivated within her. The Christmas holidays had passed, and the new year had arrived with its customary promises of renewal and fresh beginnings. Yet the Christmas stocking case, as it had come to be known in village gossip, continued to occupy a portion of her thoughts, even as she engaged in her ordinary daily activities. She reflected frequently upon the manner in which the investigation had unfolded, upon the various false paths that had been pursued, and upon the ultimate revelation of the truth that had lain beneath the surface of events throughout. It was perhaps inevitable that Inspector Morrison would eventually arrive at her cottage in St. Mary Mead to conduct what he described as a final consultation regarding certain aspects of the case that continued to perplex him. He arrived on a grey afternoon in mid-January, carrying with him a portfolio of documents and photographs that represented the accumulated evidence and testimony from the investigation and subsequent trial. "I find myself," Inspector Morrison began, once he had been settled in Miss Marple's sitting room with a cup of tea at his elbow, continuing to reflect upon the case and upon the manner in which you were able to perceive truths that were not immediately apparent to the investigation. I wonder if you might assist me in understanding your deductive process, particularly regarding the identification of Mrs. Ashford as the primary architect of the poisoning attempt." Miss Marple set down her knitting and considered the question with the sort of careful attention she gave to matters of genuine intellectual substance. "I confess that the solution did not present itself to me in a sudden moment of revelation," she began, "but rather through the gradual accumulation of observations and the recognition of patterns that seemed inconsistent with the apparent narrative that was being constructed by the investigation." "What patterns, precisely?" the inspector inquired. "The first significant pattern," Miss Marple explained, "was the nature of Eleanor's emotional disturbance. When I observed her in the immediate aftermath of the poisoning attempt, she displayed not merely shock at Lord Thornfield's condition, but a specific variety of anxiety that suggested she possessed knowledge of what had occurred beyond what would have been apparent to an innocent observer. Furthermore, her emotional attachment to Charles was evident to anyone with eyes to observe it, and yet her explanation for her involvement in the poisoning seemed inadequate to account for the considerable risks she had undertaken. "You believed she was being manipulated by her mother," the inspector observed. "I believed it likely," Miss Marple confirmed, "though not primarily through deliberate coercion. Rather, I believed that Mrs. Ashford's own emotional turmoil regarding the land transaction dispute had communicated itself to Eleanor in ways that Eleanor had interpreted as demands upon her loyalty and her participation. Children, particularly adult children, frequently respond to their parents' unstated emotional needs with actions designed to provide relief or resolution for those needs." Inspector Morrison made notes in his book, and Miss Marple continued her explanation. "The second significant pattern was the timing and circumstances of the bonbon acquisition. Eleanor's explanation for her actions focused upon her romantic motivations, yet the actual acquisition of the bonbons required knowledge of their availability and the ability to travel to Bath for their procurement. This suggested prior planning and coordination with someone who possessed both the motivation and the resources to undertake such preparation." "Mrs. Ashford," the inspector said. "Precisely so," Miss Marple agreed. Furthermore, James Hawthorne's observation that both Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford were present when the bonbons were placed in the stocking provided the crucial confirmation that mother and daughter had been collaborating in the crime, regardless of the explanations either of them had provided regarding their individual motivations. "And what of Lord Thornfield's own criminal behavior?" the inspector asked. "Did you perceive that from the outset?" "I perceived the possibility," Miss Marple said carefully, "when I observed James Hawthorne's anxiety during the initial luncheon. There was a quality to his discomfort that suggested he possessed knowledge of wrongdoing that extended beyond the immediate crime. Furthermore, Charles Thornfield's examination of the estate accounts and his discovery of irregularities suggested that there was indeed criminal behavior to be discovered. However, I confess that the precise nature of that criminal behavior did not become clear until Mr. Hawthorne himself provided the explainer." The inspector seemed satisfied with these explanations, and he departed some time later with a renewed appreciation for the complexities of the case and the manner in which apparently simple crimes frequently concealed considerably more complicated motivations and circumstances. After his departure, Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her reflections, content in the knowledge that the truth, however complicated and multifaceted, had ultimately emerged, and that justice, imperfect though it might be, had been served. The winter of that year seemed to settle upon St. Mary Mead with particular heaviness, as if the village itself were contemplating the events that had transpired at Thornfield and the revelations they had exposed regarding the hidden depths of seemingly ordinary lives. Miss Marple found herself, as the weeks progressed into February and the early hints of spring began to appear in the lengthening daylight, reflecting upon the case with the sort of philosophical distance that only the passage of time could provide. She had lived long enough to understand that the resolution of a criminal investigation rarely brought the closure that people hoped it would deliver. Justice was served, certainly, but the underlying human suffering and the damaged relationships that had preceded the crime remained largely unhealed. Eleanor Ashford had been sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment for her role in the conspiracy, a sentence that was simultaneously longer and shorter than many had anticipated. Her youth and her apparent genuine remorse had influenced the judge's decision to impose a sentence below the statutory maximum, though the court had emphasized that her voluntary participation in an attempted murder could not be overlooked or minimized. Mrs. Ashford had received a sentence of 7 years for her role as the primary architect of the poisoning attempt, and she had accepted the verdict with a stoicism that suggested she had made a deliberate peace with the consequences of her actions. Charles Thornfield had remained at Thornfield for several months following the trial, assisting his father in the reorganization of the estate finances and in the implementation of new systems designed to ensure that the financial irregularities that had previously existed would not be permitted to recur. However, by late spring, he had announced his intention to return to London, where he had secured a new position with a firm that dealt specifically with estate management and financial reconstruction for families and institutions in circumstances similar to his own. His departure from Thornfield had been marked by a certain sadness, a recognition that the village and the estate represented a part of his life that he had outgrown, and that his future lay in the broader world beyond the confines of his family's traditional domain. It was on a particularly pleasant afternoon in early May, when the gardens of St. Mary Mead were displaying their spring profusion of tulips and forget-me-nots, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. James Hawthorne had come to call, presenting himself at her cottage door with the sort of formality that suggested this was not a casual social visit, but rather something of considerably greater significance. Miss Marple invited him to take tea, and they settled themselves in her comfortable sitting-room, where the afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains in patterns that seemed to organize the dust motes into geometric formations. "I have come to inform you," Hawthorne began, after the customary exchanges regarding the weather and the general state of the village, that I have decided to resign my position as estate manager at Thornfield. Lord Thornfield has accepted my resignation with what I believe to be genuine regret, and we have mutually agreed that my departure will occur at the end of the current fiscal year." "I see," Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested that she had perhaps anticipated such a development. "And what will you do following your resignation?" "I have obtained a position with a land management company that operates properties throughout the south of England," Hawthorne explained. "It is a position that will require me to travel considerably and to undertake work that is less directly involved in estate management and more focused upon the broader questions of land conservation and preservation. I believe it is work that will suit my temperament considerably better than my previous position." Miss Marple smiled with genuine warmth. "I believe you have made a wise choice, Mr. Hawthorne. You have spent nearly a quarter of a century serving Lord Thornfield and the Thornfield estate. It is natural and appropriate that you should wish to pursue a path that offers greater autonomy and a different variety of engagement with the work that occupies your professional life. There is another matter as well," Hawthorne said, and his expression suggested that this second matter was perhaps the true purpose of his visit. "I have been reflecting considerably upon the events of the past months and upon my own role in those events. While I was not primarily responsible for the poisoning attempt, I was complicit in certain behaviors that contributed to the circumstances that led Mrs. Ashford to undertake such desperate actions. Specifically, my participation in Lord Thornfield's financial improprieties and my willingness to conceal wrongdoing in exchange for financial benefit demonstrated a lack of moral courage that I deeply regret." "You have made amends," Miss Marple observed. "Your testimony regarding your involvement with Lord Thornfield's financial arrangements was crucial to the investigation and to the eventual conviction of Mrs. Ashford. Furthermore, I am aware that you have taken considerable care to ensure that the evidence of your own criminal complicity has been properly documented and disclosed to the relevant authorities. I have attempted to do so," Hawthorne confirmed, "though I confess that I continue to wonder whether such attempts at recompense are truly sufficient to balance the scales of justice and morality. I have begun to understand, through observation of your own approach to matters of crime and moral responsibility, that true restitution requires not merely the acknowledgement of past wrongs, but a genuine commitment to the alteration of one's future conduct. "You have learned an important lesson," Miss Marple said gently, "though I would caution against excessive self-recrimination. You are a decent man who made poor choices in circumstances that were themselves morally ambiguous. Your redemption lies not in the endless flagellation of your conscience, but in the genuine effort to live more thoughtfully and more ethically in the years that remain to you." After Hawthorne had departed, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the curious manner in which the poisoning case had served as a catalyst for genuine transformation in the lives of those who had been touched by it. Lord Thornfield had begun a deliberate process of attempting to live more ethically, though Miss Marple harboured no illusions regarding the completeness or permanence of such transformation. Charles had discovered a new direction for his professional life that seemed better suited to his temperament and his values. James Hawthorne had confronted his own moral complicity and had undertaken the difficult work of attempting genuine restitution. Even Eleanor and Mrs. Ashford, though their immediate futures were constrained, by imprisonment, had been forced to confront the reality of their own actions and their consequences. The village of Thornfield, and indeed the broader village community of which it formed a part, had been forever altered by the events of that Boxing Day luncheon. The comfortable assumption that crime and violence occurred only in distant urban centres, perpetrated by people fundamentally different from the respectable villagers who lived in apparent peace and security, had been shattered. The realization that evil and desperation could lurk beneath the surface of ordinary social interaction, waiting only for the appropriate catalyst to emerge and manifest itself in violent action, was a recognition that some residents of the village continued to struggle with. Yet Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to understand that human nature contained within it the capacity for both profound goodness and considerable wickedness, viewed these revelations with a certain philosophical calm. She had learned, over the course of her long life, that the superficial orderliness of village life concealed depths of passion, resentment, and moral complexity that rarely surfaced into public view. The Christmas stocking case had merely drawn back the curtain that usually concealed these depths, allowing them to be observed and understood by those with the vision to perceive them. On a warm afternoon in late May, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking their familiar rhythm as she worked upon the completion of the sweater that had occupied her attention since before the poisoning attempt. The sweater was nearly complete, requiring only the finishing of the neckline and the weaving in of the loose threads that remained from the various stages of its construction. She reflected, as her hands moved through the familiar motions of her craft, upon the manner in which the patterns and rhythms of knitting seemed to mirror the patterns and rhythms of criminal investigation. Each stitch was necessary, each row contributed to the larger whole, and the eventual finished product emerged not from sudden inspiration but from the patient accumulation of individual actions, each one building upon the last. A single dropped stitch, if not immediately corrected, would unravel an entire row and potentially compromise the integrity of the entire garment. Similarly, a single overlooked detail in an investigation could distort the perception of all subsequent evidence and conclusions. Yet patience, careful attention, and a willingness to examine one's work from multiple angles could generally result in the achievement of the desired outcome. As she completed the final stages of the sweater's construction, Miss Marple found herself thinking of Eleanor Ashford, who was now confined within the walls of a women's prison, stripped of her freedom and her autonomy, forced to confront daily the consequences of the choices she had made. She thought of Mrs. Ashford as well, whose rage and desperation had led her to undertake actions that had destroyed not only her own life but had caused immeasurable harm to her daughter and to others whose lives had been touched by the poisoning attempt. She thought of Lord Thornfield, attempting to restructure his character and his values at an age when most people had long since settled into comfortable patterns of behavior from which they would never diverge. The case had taught Miss Marple nothing genuinely new, for her understanding of human nature had been comprehensive long before the poisoning attempt had occurred. However, it had confirmed certain truths regarding the depths of human suffering and desperation that could drive ordinary people to extraordinary crimes. It had demonstrated once again that the visible surf, ace of society, concealed currents of passion and resentment that could emerge with surprising violence when the appropriate conditions were met. And it had reinforced her conviction that understanding crime required not merely the examination of physical evidence, but a profound comprehension of human psychology and motivation. As the summer advanced and the village gradually moved forward in its collective life, the Christmas stocking case receded into the background of public memory and private reflection. New scandals and excitements emerged to capture the attention of the villagers. The ordinary routines of village life reasserted themselves. Yet Miss Marple continued to carry the lessons and insights of the case within her consciousness, understanding that each crime, each disruption of the ordinary patterns of life, added incrementally to her understanding of human nature and the complex motivations that drove people to violence and transgression. She completed her sweater and began work on a new project, a pair of mittens designed for a new grandchild of one of her distant relatives. Her hands moved through the familiar patterns. Her mind continued its characteristic work of observation and reflection, and the village of St. Mary Mead settled into the rhythms of summer life, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and that the threat of violence had been removed, at least for the present moment. Yet Miss Marple, wise in the ways of human nature, understood that such security was always temporary, that the underlying currents of passion and desperation that had manifested in the Christmas stocking case would inevitably surface again in new forms and new circumstances. And when they did, she would be ready to observe, to listen, and to perceive the truths that others had failed to recognize.